Pronouns are a second point of English grammar tested in a variety of ways on the GMAT. The definition of a pronoun is simply a word that takes the place of a noun obviously being a person, place, or a thing. So, for example, the sunset was beautiful. The sunset is a noun. It can be replaced by something like a word it, right? It was beautiful. The sunset was beautiful. I'm replacing it with a pronoun it, and so forth. John is my friend. So John is the noun, person, place, or thing. I can replace it with he. He is my friend. So that's what a pronoun is. And there are several important rules that the GMAT is going to test your knowledge of when it comes to pronouns. Rule number 1, simple and straightforward, but nevertheless, the pronouns must be in the correct case. What do I mean by case? Well, I mean either the subject version, the object version, or the possessive version. That's the case of the pronoun. And just as we used I like cake and the bracketing technique to get to that point for subject-verb agreement, it's also incredibly useful for zeroing in on pronouns and deciding whether or not a pronoun is in the correct case. You want to use the I like cake bracketing technique to test if a pronoun is in the correct form. And remember, I like cake. I is the subject. If a pronoun could correctly fit in that part of the sentence, that means you need the subject version of that pronoun. Does that make sense? I mean, if it's going to fill the subject slot, if you break it down to I like cake and we're talking about the subject part of that sentence, you need to make sure you have the subject form of the pronoun. Like is just the verb, and then likewise the object. The receiver of the action, that's the object, is the object part of the sentence. And if the pronoun in question is in that part of the I like cake sentence, then you need to make sure that you have the object form of the pronoun. Proper case. Let's make sure you know what they are. So pronouns must be in the correct case. I, the subject pronoun, like cake, you would use the object pronoun. What are subject pronouns? Well, here they are. And if you've ever studied a foreign language, you know these. It's interesting. A lot of times students whose English isn't their first language know our grammar better, than we do, and they very, very well know the subject form, the object form, etc. We may have to kind of brush up on it, especially if it's been a while since you've studied a foreign language. But it's I, it's you, it's he, it's she, right? I mean, what would fit in the first part of I like cake sentence? I like cake, you like cake, he likes cake, she likes cake, we like cake, they like cake. I suppose if it's ET, it could like cake, and who likes cake would be kind of the question version of that, right? So our ear tells us what should go there. It's not like you need to memorize this chart or anything, but I just want to brush up on it and make sure you know what we're even talking about. And likewise, if we're trying to make sure we have the correct pronoun in the part of the sentence that is the object or the receiver of the verb, we need to make sure we're using the object version. So I like cake, I like me, I suppose I could like me, I like you, I like him, I like us, I like them, I like it, right? And so that would be the object case. And then obviously the possessive. It is mine, it is yours, it is ours, it is theirs, it is its. If it's ET's, whose is it? And so that would be the possessive form there. So go ahead. I don't think you need to necessarily memorize that, but just understand what we're talking about, and your ear and your understanding of English should enable you to pick the correct form. But that does bring us back then to, okay, using the bracketing technique, can we choose the correct form of the pronoun? Let's look again at this example. This is our example where we had everyone on both sides except the pitcher, and, well, now we're back. Is it I, is it me? We know subject and verb agree. We already did the bracketing technique, but is it I or is it me? Which do we choose? And maybe you were thinking when we did it before, well, it should be the pitcher and I. It's always something and I, right? The pitcher and I, my brother and I, my dad and I. Is it? Well, this is a very common mistake made when we speak English day to day. We hear it on the news, all of those types of things, and yet the GMAT will test it. It's going to make sure that you know how to wade through it and choose the correct form, the correct case of the pronoun. So apply I like cake to the sentence and see what you think. Well, the subject is everyone, right? We already decided that when we did the bracketing technique and we pared it down to the basic I like cake sentence, it was everyone was injured. We've already accounted for the subject, haven't we? That means everything else has to be the object pronoun, right? It's part of that prepositional phrase, on both sides, except the pitcher and me. So me is actually correct because it's got to be the object pronoun. Why? Because I'm not the subject of the sentence. If I were the subject of the sentence, somehow, like if everyone on both sides except weren't there, if the sentence simply read the pitcher and I were injured in the game, then certainly I would be part of the subject. Does that make sense? Using the subject-verb rules we just taught. But that's not what the sentence says. It's not the pitcher and I were injured. The pitcher and I, everybody except the pitcher and I. So now I'm part of the object. I'm part of what's receiving from the subject of the sentence. And so, again, use the bracketing technique, pare it down, and it should help you choose whether you use the subject pronoun or object pronoun. All right, it gets a little bit more complicated, a little bit more complex. So let's dive a little bit deeper into pronouns with Rule 1A. Pronouns must always be in the correct case. And here's something that the GMAT likes to test that students have a tough time with, but once I teach you this rule, hopefully you'll never get this wrong again. You will always use this subject pronoun, I, you, he, she, they, after the verb to be. For example, is, are, was, will be. I mean, you have to identify that a verb is part of a conjugation of the verb to be. And this is something, when somebody calls you on the phone and say, hi, may I please speak with Sally, or may I please speak with John, whatever your name is, what do you say? This is him. Technically, grammatically, you should say this is he. So if somebody says, hello, may I please speak with Brett, and I'm answering the phone, I should say this is he. Why? Because I'm restating the subject. This meaning me, I, the subject, this is he, right? I'm restating it, so I actually need the subject version. And how do I know? Well, because the pronoun is following the verb to be. This is, and so forth, right? So that's for answering the phone. The GMAT's not going to test whether or not you know how to answer the phone, but the GMAT may test an example like this. The best spokesperson for our group would be either, and then you choose, he/him, he or him, or Trevor. The best spokesperson for our group would be either he or Trevor, or the best spokesperson for our group would be either him or Trevor. What do you think? Go ahead and press pause. It follows the verb to be, doesn't it? I mean, I just taught you the rule, and so it's got to be the subject version. And very few people in the world that you hear speak will correctly use the subject form of the pronoun there, and yet that's technically correct. And grammatically, it's correct to the point where you got to know that if you're going to get a correct answer on the GMAT. Your ear may deceive you. That may sound weird to you. It may even look weird to you, probably because you hardly even see people write it correctly anymore. And yet that's nevertheless correct. Following the verb to be, use the subject version of the pronoun. Rule 1B has to do with comparisons. If you see a GMAT sentence where the subject pronoun is being compared, you use a subject pronoun in comparisons following words like than or as, which are comparison types of words. Here's an example. So Rule 1B is still at the top. You can refer back to it. And the sentence is fairly simple. John likes sailing more than, so it's a comparison, more than, John likes sailing more than I or more than me? Well, I just said we want to use the subject pronoun in comparisons following words like than or as. So John likes sailing more than I. And that sounds weird, right? But that's correct. John likes sailing more than I. Here's a tip for you. If you have trouble remembering whether to use the subject or object pronoun in comparison sentences, mentally complete the sentence. Or just reverse the order of sentence. But here's what I mean by that. Technically, isn't this kind of the logical continuation of the sentence? John likes sailing more than I like sailing. That's the comparison. And yet the sentence could be cut short. It's perfectly correct to say John likes sailing more than I. But if you need to mentally continue the sentence when you see a comparison, it'll help you remember, okay, it's got to be the subject version, because really the subject, it's like I'm a new subject in this comparison. You could also flip-flop the sentence. I like sailing less, in this case, than John likes sailing. That's okay as well. A lesser tested rule, but nevertheless something that I want to point out as it pertains to pronouns. Which brings us to rule number 2. Rule number 2 says that pronouns must agree in number, singular or plural, and case. We just went over case, subject, object, or possessive, with the words to which they refer. So we're upping it a notch. Not only do we need to know what part of the sentence we're in, we also now need to identify, okay, what's this pronoun referring back to? Because now I got to choose correctly whether to use the singular or the plural of that pronoun. Does that make sense? So here's an example for you. Of the two leaders, neither Trotsky nor Lenin was most brilliant, but each worked in their sphere for the party. Go ahead and press pause and see what you think. Do you detect anything wrong in this sentence? Maybe there's not, but maybe there is. Go ahead and press pause. All right, well, let me go ahead and kind of walk us through a step-by-step approach to pronouns. When you see a pronoun on the GMAT in a sentence correction question, light bulbs should be going off, red flags should be going up, and you should identify that pronoun. And here we see a pronoun there. And it's in the underlined portion. That's important. We know that means that's where there's potentially going to be something that needs to change in the underlined portion. And so we see this pronoun there. And our checklist starts by identifying the pronoun. I see it. It's there. Step 2 is, okay, is it the correct case? And we just went over subject, object. We didn't really go over possessive, but possessive simply means, does the pronoun possess something? In this case, it's their sphere, right? They, Trotsky, Lenin, each, I don't know if it's going to stay they, but the point is it's possessing the sphere, their sphere, right? And so it's clearly possessive. That's correct. No problems there. You would want to also make sure in a different example that it's either the object version or the subject version. Okay, so in this case, that's correct. Step 3 then is, okay, now, what word does it refer to? What word does that pronoun refer back to? And the answer is each, right? Hopefully you got that. Hopefully you saw that. But each worked in what? Worked in their sphere. There, the pronoun is in line with and referring back to each. Does that make sense? Pronouns aren't easy, but you need to learn what I'm teaching you, and you need to practice. You need to do practice problems. We're going to go over a few more here together, but this is important that you identify that. So step 1, good to go. Step 2, good to go. Step 3 refers back to the word each, and now we can ask the question, okay, does it need to be plural or singular? Step 4 is the pronoun in the correct number, singular or plural? And I refer you back to indefinite pronouns. Is each singular, always plural, or does it depend? Each is always singular. So each is singular, there, the pronoun must be singular as well. It needs to be changed to his. It's confusing, isn't it? I mean, we're not going to trip up on it. And if I were saying this sentence to you in everyday conversation, first of all, you'd probably think I'm weird talking about Trotsky and Lenin in everyday conversation. But nevertheless, you wouldn't stumble on that. It wouldn't really bother your ear to hear me say that. And people speak that way all the time. They use the plural pronoun all the time when they should be using the singular pronoun. Technically, however, the way the sentence read originally, what it meant was that each worked in there, like some other people in the abstract, like pointing over there. Trotsky and Lenin, each of them worked in there, like Bob and John and Sue's sphere for the party. Obviously, those aren't Russian names, but you know what I'm saying, right? And clearly the sentence is implying, though, they're working in their own sphere. Does that make sense? Each is working in his sphere. They're working in their own sphere, but in this case it's singular each. Each is working in his sphere. Okay, I hope that explanation makes sense. Step 4 is where we now identify there is a mistake. The plural, currently plural pronoun needs to be changed to the singular his. And rule number 3, let's move on with pronouns. Rule number 3 says that pronouns, and we just saw this a little bit there, it was a little bit confusing, right? Are they talking about somebody else's sphere or their own sphere? Rule 3 says that pronouns must clearly refer to a noun or to another pronoun without confusion or ambiguity. you need to have your antenna up for this, because sometimes when you read it, you know what they're talking about. I mean, you're not stumbling, you know what the sentence means, and you can gloss right over it. But that's why we need to figure out what the pronoun is. You need to pinpoint the pronoun, and you need to filter it through your understanding of pronoun rules to decide whether or not, okay, we're good to go or not. Here's an example for you. Minutes before John's meeting with Frank, comma, his secretary called to say that an urgent situation had come up and the meeting would need to be rescheduled. What's the pronoun? And is it confusing? Does a change need to be made? Right? The pronoun is his, right? It's a possessive pronoun. His what? His secretary. But the question is, what does his refer to? Remember rule number 2, and rule number 3 for that matter, a pronoun must clearly refer to a noun or another pronoun. In this case, whose secretary called? John's or Frank's? We don't know. Minutes before John's meeting with Frank, John's secretary called, Frank's secretary called. Just because it's closest to Frank's, is that obvious? It doesn't mean it's necessarily Frank's. So it's important, and I don't have answer choices for you there. It would have to be changed somehow to be made less ambiguous, and you would want to look for answer choices that clearly make that change. Here's a final tip for you. A lot of what the GMAT tests in terms of sentence corrections boils down to agreement. Subject-verb agreement, pronoun agreement. Does the pronoun agree with the noun that it's referring to? And so agreement is a significant point of grammar tested on the GMAT. And when you are going through your mental checklist of common grammar mistakes, or even just when you're reading the sentence the first time through, stop. Whenever you see a noun, verb, or pronoun, right, those are what we've been talking about, whether or not it's underlined. If you see a noun, stop, check, decide. Same thing with verbs, same thing with pronouns. What are we going to do? We're going to go over what we just did. You want to bracket, you want to do whatever it takes to establish what word or phrase it is related to or referring to, and then see whether or not those two parts, those two things are in agreement. Again, subject-verb agreement, pronoun agreement. So hopefully these rules have helped you with subject-verb agreement, and then also here with pronouns. Learn them, master them, practice them, and with that we can turn our attention to the next common point of grammar tested on the GMAT, which is misplaced modifiers.